Ladies, gentlemen and virtual friends, a very warm welcome to all of you for this design-focused, COVID-safe event as part of Design Canberra 2020. My name's Genevieve Jacobs. I'm going to be stitching various things together, facilitating and keeping the links flowing smoothly. This is the 2 Minutes to Midnight series, taking many of the ideas around design that this festival explores and then applying them to the sometimes quite urgent considerations of our everyday life, how design can flourish and enhance life, what challenges it can help to meet, and how central it is to our well-being, certainly here in this very beautiful city of ours. Tonight, the focus is on suburbia and what we all need to survive and to thrive. For us here in Canberra, you might say never more timely as our city continues to develop at almost warp speed, and there's uneasiness attached to that process. How do we do this well? What decisions do we need to make about our public and private spaces to create a city that does more than just make money, but also builds communities? More broadly though, what's the role of design? And this is an interesting and a really pertinent question at this time of COVID. We've had a real impact from the pandemic on how we live, how we work, how we connect with one another. Are there perhaps lessons in how to build a better community from the solutions we've arrived at during these strange, fraught months of 2020? Shelley Penn is our provocateur for this conversation. She's with us via Zoom from Melbourne. She is an architect and urbanist with a close connection to Canberra via her former role as the chair of the National Capital Authority. Much of her work centres on strategic advice to government and the private sector on architecture and urban design for public places across all scales. And she's got an enduring commitment to enriching culture, improving social outcomes and to sustainability through advancing the quality of the built environment. Andrew Lee, over here on your left, is the member for Fenner here in Canberra. He has a long history as a thinker about what builds good communities and how government can facilitate that process for the betterment of all of us. Andrew has written widely about economics and their connection to social issues, both in his previous career as a Professor of Economics at the ANU and his current incarnation as a member of the House of Representatives and the Shadow Assistant Minister for Treasury and Charities. His latest book is Reconnected, a Community Builder's Handbook with Nick Terrell. Catherine Simpson, Green the Street founder, urban designer and placemaker, is also with us here, live and in person. She is a fervent believer that urban design is becoming a social determinant of health and well-being, and that the most exciting work often happens between the spaces, at the intersection of art and design, health and the landscape. As an urban designer and placemaker, she has more than a decade of experience working in international multidisciplinary firms from London to Copenhagen and New Zealand. Now, a couple of pieces of housekeeping. This event is being live streamed and recorded for future reference. Andrew does have to duck out shortly after the speakers are finished, but we'll continue the conversation, and we've already mapped out which pieces of equipment he may or may not trip over on his way out. So just beware of him as he exits. Shelley's role is to shape the ideas in this event, to frame the subject and draw all the threads together as the conversation emerges. After we've heard from everyone, I'll ask her to summarise and to draw out a couple of big ideas that perhaps we all take home with us, that we take into our own future engagement with design. There will be time for plenty of questions from you after we've heard from the panel, and if you're watching online and would like to forward some questions, then we've got the capacity for that too. But for now, on the subject of 2 Minutes to Midnight, this is Suburbia. Shelley, it's over to you.
Thanks, Genevieve.
I think we have...
Sorry, it's slightly...
Okay.
It's like I can't see all of you, and I hope I'm not too loud.
Got you. Not now.
I might turn myself down a bit because I can hear the echo. Thanks, Genevieve. I acknowledge the eloquent will and people of the Kulin Nations on whose unceded country I live and where I am right now. I acknowledge their elders, past, present and emerging, and I'm grateful for their ongoing connection to, care of and belonging to country. I also acknowledge the Ngunnawal people, traditional owners of the land you're gathered on tonight. And hello everybody. I'm sorry I can't be there, but I wish you all a thought-provoking evening and a fabulous festival. We're only a few weeks out from Christmas, and we're beginning to wind down from what has been an incredible year. I can't help feeling that 2020 has been, yes, a time of rapid change, but also a kind of full stop or an exclamation mark or perhaps an expletive, a time for pause and review whether we've liked it or not. On a very personal front, the starting to wind down 2020 has meant tentatively booking an interstate holiday, heading north to sunshine, hoping to visit family and enjoy a summer break, something that simply didn't happen last year. I farewelled 2019 in tears. I remember watching the ABC News on the 31st of December, appalled at the increasing ferocity and extent of the bushfires. In the early days of 2020, as they continued to escalate, we speculated preemptively on getting to Canberra at some stage, not to hit the beach, as has been our ritual for 16 years, but to help in whatever way we could. This photo is borrowed from the Wiki Commons, a view from Tuggeranong toward the Auroral Valley Fire in Namadgi National Park, taken in early January. The 2019 bushfires were shocking and deeply confronting for Australia and beyond. Surely a wake-up call like no other. Surely a time to change tack, to set aside political motivations and to act strongly and with urgency on climate change. Then this. We didn't make it to the coast at Easter to help clean up or spend big on local business. We were in lockdown. Like the effects of climate change, a major global pandemic was an eventuality that had long been predicted by the experts, but not adequately planned for. Now we were living it. This time, necessary, enforced, and in some cases prolonged lockdown was the driver for self-examination, for many of us at a personal level, and for us all as a society. And what we saw wasn't always nice. But while the measures required to suppress COVID-19 have been devastating for many people, they've also enabled new insights into how we live and what we need as individuals and communities. For some, the working from home and associated access to more time for family, for self, for the juggle of life's needs has been profoundly positive. It's demonstrated that to employers that staff working remotely can be very productive and has opened the path to much more flexible work practices and therefore opportunities. It's also shown the scope for housing to be more adaptable, highlighted the need for safe, accessible, green and open spaces for recreation and respite, and the criticality of local streets and spaces that support healthy and safe community engagement and connection. And while COVID-19 still rages around the world, we've recently watched the presidential elections in North America. Along with the shocking fact that more than 73 million people voted for Donald Trump, a proven and outright liar, we've watched the proliferation of conspiracy theories, extremist influences and widespread distrust, not just of government, but of the media, our neighbours and sometimes even friends and family members. And it's not just the US, again it's global, although thankfully to a far lesser degree here in Australia. Trump seems merely emblematic of deeper, wider flaws. Democracy is in question. Societal norms we've taken for granted appear threatened. What happened to human decency, respect and care? I want to take an extra minute to read you a short note from Nick Cave's The Red Hand Files. It's a forum where he responds to random questions from anyone on anything each week. I thoroughly recommend subscribing to it. In this case, the questioner is Pat, who asks, in this time of illness, cynicism and cruelty, do you receive many mean or vile messages? How do you cope with that kind of negative energy? And Nick replies, Dear Pat, the letters sent to the Red Hand Files are mostly beautiful, full of love and a joy to read, but I do get the odd unkind message. Generally, though, I like them and find them weirdly energising. There's nothing quite like a good death threat in the morning to get the juices flowing. They're a form of validation, really, as no one with a public platform and an opinion is doing his or her job effectively if they're not being attacked from time to time. Having said that, Pat, when you say that we're living in a time of cynicism and cruelty, I'm not sure I agree with you. I think we're living through a frightening and deeply uncertain time. And though there are dementing and cynical voices out there, which are being emboldened and amplified by social media, that loony engine of outrage, they do not represent the voices of the many or the good. My experience of actual people in this time is overwhelmingly positive. There is a great deal of love and mutual regard and community. I think most of us understand that in order to rise above this particular moment, we must pull together and act with civility, generosity and kindness. We have a monumental task ahead of us that will require vast reserves of energy. We must rehabilitate the world, and this fellow feeling and mutual respect is essential to the process. I began tonight with a micro perspective, my personal end to 2019, weeping as I watched the news. I did that because I believe the answers to these huge existential issues of climate, disease on a global scale, population growth and social cohesion lie within our humanity. It's easy to feel that design seems of marginal relevance in the context of such huge issues, but the scale of one person's experience is to gain insight. Our experience of the world, our relationships with it and with one another are the starting point for understanding one another better and for empathy and compassion, which are critical for creating places that support people and a good society. Design is in how we plan cities, suburbs, transport systems, streets and public places, as well as individual buildings, landscapes and elements within them. And the nature and quality of places shapes much of how we relate and connect to one another, and even how we see ourselves. Winston Churchill said, "We shape our buildings, thereafter they shape us." What we build reflects our values, yes, but it also affects our experiences, our relationships, our ability to engage with civic life. The design quality of shared community and civic streets and spaces affects whether we feel included in our communities and valued by society, whether we feel welcomed and therefore able to contribute to it, regardless of background, ability or socioeconomic status. We intuitively understand that someone thought about us in well-designed, well-maintained places, the quality of paving, the location of a comfortable seat in a safe, accessible and pleasant spot, the layering of carefully selected, well-tended plants, shows an investment in us as human, feeling users of those places, and the evidence shows we're more inclined to respect and care for those places because we feel respected within them. These experiences of our world extend to how likely we are to be physically healthy, to a sense of well-being, whether we're likely to nod and smile at another person in the street or to know our neighbour, and how likely we are to be kind or generous or just respectful towards others in our communities. Design quality affects how likely we are to drop or pick up rubbish, to tend the nature strip or shared rooftop garden, to vandalise a railway station or graffiti a random wall. We need places that function well, are environmentally sustainable, are on time and on budget, but that's not enough. Good design is also about health and well-being in the broader sense. Places that are inclusive, welcoming, amenable and safe, that talk to the human spirit and our ability and need to feel delight and to experience beauty. But good design also means, and I believe this is critical, specificity and responsiveness to context and place. This is about personal connection to the particular places we live and to the particular meanings they hold. That meaning is a continuum. Much of it is shared through local histories where certain places tell stories of what happened before, but it's more far-reaching, complex and subtle than identified heritage icons, and is also about personal relationships with place and places as a framework or background for our lives. I believe it starts with landscape, natural and built. Topography, the shape of the horizon. Is it urban rooftops and idiosyncratic chimneys, or rolling hills, or the sea? A certain quality of light, or a regular anticipated breeze. And then finer details like a special street tree where your kids used to climb, or a waterway where you've seen a platypus a few times, a distant hill, a particular view. Maybe it's a certain breadth and flatness that means the sky and its changes are always most prominent, and the subtle variations in colour are what you notice most each day. Or the density of urban life in your favourite pathway to work or for weekend walks, the proportions and details of your street and the buildings that line it, the predominance of a particular style or brick or roof form, etc. By example, Canberra has a remarkable and distinctive characteristics that belong to its endemic landscape and to its plant qualities. The pervasive landscape is one that operates at city scale and is also present at the scale of suburbs, where there are also other fine-grained and special local qualities that people know and connect to. 2020 has given us an opportunity to understand ourselves and one another better. and to address diverse needs for how we work and live more meaningfully and more equitably. Good design, compassionate design, is critical to support human health and well-being, our sense of belonging and connection within society. With every project, however big or small, we're creating legacy. The question is whether that will be good or bad. And I'm very much hoping that Andrew and Catherine can shed light on some of the ways we can ensure the legacy is excellent. Back to you.
Shelley, thank you. And in fact, it's over to Andrew, who's going to talk to us about the decline of community life in Australia over the past couple of generations, the extent to which telecommuting might now perhaps slow the pace of urbanisation, and also the role of urban design in a reconnected Australia.
Thank you, Genevieve. I acknowledge the Ngunnawal people, Dara Nuna, Dara Ngunnawal, Yongu, Nalamanyan, Dunimanyan, Ngunnawalwari, Dara Wari, Dindi, Manila Dinjinjin. And I acknowledge any Indigenous people present tonight. I think the theme for Design Canberra's 2 minutes to midnight is so wonderfully apt. C.P. Snow talked about the two cultures, the humanities and sciences, being apart. But when the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists tried to capture the world's imagination on existential risk, what do? They turned to designers to design that famous doomsday clock, where the hands were originally set, I think it was at 7 minutes to midnight. The designer was asked why afterwards, and she said, "Oh, that's where I thought it looked good." And that was an image that captured the imagination of so many and led so many to be concerned about the danger that nuclear war posed to the planet. An existential threat that now sits alongside pandemics, artificial intelligence and climate change as among the things that need to deeply concern serious policymakers. I wanted to talk tonight about the way in which Australia has moved from being a communitarian we society to an individualistic me society, and how we might move back again. The research I want to talk about is based on work that I've done inspired by Robert Putnam, who 20 years ago wrote a book called Bowling Alone. A handful of years after that, I had Putnam out to Canberra for a conference that I was organising when I was then a professor at the Australian National University. We took Bob and his wife Rosemary out to dinner afterwards and ended up in O'Connor after popping to a couple of the other small suburban shopping centres. I remember Bob saying to me, "This is unlike anything else I've ever seen," and speculating then that the way in which Canberra's urban design was set up was potentially one reason why the strength of civic life here in Canberra was greater than in other parts of Australia. That said, Canberra and the rest of Australia hasn't fared well when it comes to the strength of community life over the course of the last 2 generations. The share of Australians who regularly attend religious services has fallen by 2/3 since the 1950s. The share of Australians who are members of a union has also fallen by 2/3 just since the early 1980s. When the TV show Neighbours began airing in 1985, Australians knew twice as many of their real neighbours as we do today. And since then, we've halved the number of close friends we have, the number of friends with whom we say we could share a confidence. There's a quarter as many Australian associations now as in the late 1970s. Not surprisingly, Australians are less likely to join those associations. We're less likely to volunteer our time, to give money to charitable causes. Australians are less likely to vote, and if they do, more likely to spoil the ballot paper. We're less likely to be members of civic organisations, political organisations, and sporting organisations. Since Bob wrote Bowling Alone in 2000, the share of Australians who do 10-pin bowling or lawn bowling has fallen. The sports that are rising are mostly individualistic sports, going for a walk or going to the gym. Meanwhile, cricket, rugby, squash, tennis, these are all sports that are on the wane. And at the same time as Australia's community life has waned, we've seen a fraying in the egalitarian compact. Over the course of the last generation, the gap between wages and the factory floor and the corner office has widened. Wages have grown 3 times as fast for the top tenth of the distribution as for the bottom tenth. The top 1% share has doubled. Australians have more billionaires than we did a generation ago. I used to see these two trends as being separate. I did a bit of work on the community building side, and I did a bit of work on the egalitarian side. But I'm increasingly persuaded that the two are part of the same puzzle. It's all about Australia moving from a communitarian we society to an individualistic me society. Indeed, in his new book, The Upswing, Robert Putnam, writing with Shelley and Garrett, documents a fascinating trend in American books. He creates a we to me index by using Google Books' scanned archive of millions of published books to look at the number of times in a given year published books use the word we and the number of times they use the word me. And he finds that over the course of the 20th century, that index slowly rose as America moved from quite an individualistic culture in the 1890s through to a much more collectivist culture in the 1960s. And since then, the we to me index in American books has fallen again. As you imagine, books like Ayn Rand's have replaced books like Jane Jacobs. And we've moved from, or America at least, has moved from publishing books which use the word we to publishing books that use the word me. The analysis that Nick Terrell and I do for Reconnected shows something of a similar pattern for books published about Australia. Even in Australian books, you can detect a move away. What should we do about it? Well, this is probably the moment at which I should confess that really you've invited the wrong Lee along tonight. For those of you who know my wife Gwyneth, you'd be aware that she is a landscape architect who is a researcher on design and public health, and therefore far better qualified than a politician to answer the questions tonight. But let me sketch out a few rough ideas. In part, I think it is about moving away from the rhetoric of leaners and lifters, the divisive rhetoric that says that Australia needs to be a country that prizes hard work and puts the successful on pedestals while kicking the unlucky into the gutter. We need to recognise the social safety net is there for all of us, that it's a great Australian invention and needs to be strengthened, not undermined. We also need to encourage the growth of civic organisations. Nick and I wrote Reconnected because we didn't just want to describe the problem, we wanted to talk about some of the solutions. And there's fabulous solutions afoot right across the country. We coined the phrase double plus good social capital, borrowing it from George Orwell's dystopian novel 1984 to describe social capital building projects that are ticking 2 boxes, like the singles tree planting events that Greening Australia runs right here in the ACT, where you can improve the environment and potentially meet the love of your life. Double plus good social capital is extremely important in a time-poor world, in which it's important to provide people more opportunities to volunteer. We talk about cyber connecting, about using technology more effectively. And we talk about the importance of great design. Design in architecture that puts staircases in the middle of buildings. Design in landscape architecture that prizes bike paths and green design. And design that's built from talking to local people, such as the work that's being done to revitalise the Skull and Shops, thanks to a strong local community association. So thank you to all of you. I know I'm at a design event when I walk in and I am definitely the worst dressed person in the room. But as somebody who's married a landscape architect, is fascinated by design and really enjoys these conversations, it's a privilege to be here and to be part of the discussion. Thanks again.
Andrew, I know you've got to leave in a moment, so before I go on to Catherine, just a question without notice. I've got to know what Bob Putnam thought was so remarkable about the O'Connor shops.
It's that idea, Genevieve, that you've got a city where you don't have to burn a litre of petrol to buy a litre of milk, where you can walk down to the local shops and see your neighbours there. It doesn't work for everybody, but if you compare it to a city like Boston, it's an incredibly vibrant and walkable space. And I just love those serendipitous conversations that I'll have with neighbours at the Hackett shops.
Yep.
And the bits of gossip you'll pick up, the stories you'll share, that privilege of being in a city which has those local nodes of community all around it.
No, I'm a great fan myself of the Lynham shops, and I know I'm not alone in this room in loving the Lynham shops, so I think for many of the same reasons. Thank you. You just completely piqued my curiosity about the O'Connor shops. Catherine, let's turn to you. Catherine's going to talk about public spaces in our cities and how we should be reclaiming them as we go through that process of further densifying and urbanising, but with a particular focus on the street.
That's right, yeah, thank you. Is this working?
Yep, you're on, I think.
Oh, brilliant, okay. Thank you for that. So, to start, let's see if the clicker works. Clicker does not work.
Andrew, while we're working that out, and you're still with us, it would be actually fantastic to just have the opportunity to ask a couple of questions about what you've just said and how that connects with the idea of urban design. We've been talking a moment ago about the shops and how well they work in Canberra's context, but Canberra actually has a very communitarian design, doesn't it? And is that something my sense is that we are trying to head back towards that, but without the spaces, you can't really articulate the community.
Yes, I think the spaces are enormously important, and the indoor spaces as well. I mean, we've all worked in buildings that are isolating and don't have those common areas, and we've worked in buildings that really celebrate the serendipitous connections. So, I'm really struck by what you can do with good design and the ability to allow play spaces. So the plethora of ovals, I think, is really important to the strength of sporting participation. And also the ability to allow people to engage in public transport and active transit. The great thing about public transport is it isn't just more environmentally sound, it's more socially positive because you get that experience of chatting to strangers. If you go to New York City, you meet people who are good at socialising. Not because they have a socialising gene, but because you have to be good at socialising when you do it a lot. Socialising is like a muscle. Before I got into politics, I found it quite confronting to walk up to a handful of strangers and start a conversation. When I have to do that half a dozen times a day, I don't find it confronting any longer. And I think that same dynamic drives Australian socialising and is one reason why we can be in a virtuous cycle if we encourage socialising.
And I guess the question, we're optimistically watching the screen here and thinking that we might be just at a solution for the clicker problem, fingers crossed. Are we good to go? Yep, I think so. Okay.
Cool.
Catherine, take it away.
Awesome. Thank you. So the first question, and I think I just gave it away, but whoa. All right, the clicker is working, I think. What is 30% to 40% of public city land in Australia? Can anyone guess? Oh. We've got some clever people in the audience, yeah. It's a space that every single one of us uses every day, and you are right, it is the street. The street is our biggest public space, and it's a type of space that is fairly monofunctional. In Australia, in particular, and the US as well, it's transit-oriented and car and bus dominated. And so what I mean when I say the street is the road, our highways, our alleyways, our laneways. We design the street not for people, but for cars. It's well known that Australian cities are designed around the car. If you're looking at the screen on the right, I'm from Brisbane, and thank you very much for having me, Canberra, sunny Canberra. This is a beautiful river. What did we do? We put a highway on it. That's the Riverside Expressway. In the middle, you can see, I don't even know what to call it, it's like a spaghetti junction motorway that you have to access as you go out of Brisbane, and it crosses a creek. Stunning landscape, but that's what we do. And of course, most recently, we've become really good at destroying some of our cultural spaces in favour of highways, and that's in Victoria. So what do I mean when I say we're a car-dominant country? Well, if I give the example of Brisbane, and I will come to Canberra, I promise, that means that 75% of us drive to work versus only 5% or so who walk or cycle. 10% take public transport. It's so bad that in our state, the state government is creating a walking strategy, which has been about as useful as a chocolate teapot. In 2018, we saw a 32% increase in pedestrian fatalities compared to the last 5 years, which means not only are we not getting better, we're getting way worse. It takes way too long to cross our roads, and it is increasingly, how do I put it? It's pretty easy to get hit by a car. So Canberra. Canberra is the same. And actually most of the cities in Australia are the same. A lot of people will think, oh yeah, Brisbane is a bit of a backwater, but if you look at the cultural capital of Australia, which is Melbourne, they're almost identical as well. The one thing that Canberra in comparison has is that you guys actually do walk or cycle more, but you're lower on public transport, which means that looking at the numbers, it's pretty much like for like. The street of today in Australia occupies 30 to 40% of city public land. It's hugely inefficient. I'll get to that in a second, because 95% of the cars on the road are actually idle during the day. So if you think about that really closely, it doesn't quite make sense. And it's a type of transport, out of all other transports, cycling, buses, trains, that leads to and promotes noise pollution, depression, obesity, carbon emissions, climate change, the urban heat island effect, the list goes on. When I say it's inefficient, this is what I mean. This is a car with single occupants on the one side, and I'm sure a lot of people have seen this. It goes back to 2001. We've known this for quite a while. The bus in the centre and cyclists to the right. But what's probably most important about the street, from an urban design perspective, is that if you commute by car, you are more likely to suffer from the following lifestyle diseases: depression, financial worries, which is, sorry, not a disease, but, you know, it's up there. You're less likely to get the recommended 7 hours of sleep. You're more likely to be obese. And there's a causal link between cars and obesity, heart disease, cancer, diabetes, and loneliness. It is the worst rated day-to-day activity for well-being. Why this is important, and I'll get back to this later, is we're seeing a few megatrends at the moment in urban design. Rapid urbanization, which everybody knows about, I'm sure, in this audience. The global lifestyle disease burden, which is increasing, climate change, and sort of in response, the growth of the healthy city. Now, COVID is not on there. Admittedly, it should be, but what COVID is really interesting for is what it's doing to these particular things. It's almost supercharging trends. Oops, phone went backwards. And again, if we're talking about megatrends, the street basically contributes to this. This is a really good example of where we are heading in terms of urban design and streets. On the left, you have Brisbane. That's the floods in 2011. On the right, you have Canberra. That's the result of the bushfires last year and this year. So it's really difficult, though, to talk about climate change and to say that we should change street design because of climate change. So instead of doing that, for political expediency, let's talk about health. So, it's a really big health problem. I think we've established that. Lifestyle disease is going to be one of the biggest costs to all developed societies, and increasingly all developing societies in the next 20 to 30 years. It's because obesity and diabetes are increasing, high blood pressure is increasing, as is heart disease. And most of these things have a direct link to the kinds of environments that we live in. And if you're an urban designer, I'm sure a few people have seen this, but it's quite well known that healthcare genes and biology are only responsible for about 20% of your health. The majority of the reasons for why you're healthy or unhealthy are determined to an extent by the environment you're in. The biggest is socioeconomics, but that can be mediated by the built environment. The others are healthy behaviours, again, can be mediated and mitigated by the environment you live in, and finally the physical environment directly. So what can we do about that? Well, the biggest one that's coming out at the moment is this idea of access to green space. So one of the reasons we have green space around us, and one of the big key ideas that's coming through increasingly in the evidence base, is that it lowers your BMI, overweight and obesity levels if you're exposed to green space on a regular basis. It has effects on your circulatory disease, coronary heart disease, in part because of these following cascading effects. When you're in green space, your heart rate lowers, your pulse rate lowers, your cortisol levels decrease, you see lower sympathetic nerve activity, activity in the subgenual prefrontal cortex of your brain, which is linked to depression, also lowers. We feel calmer and more relaxed. So there's all these physiological effects to being in green space. Essentially, it's this idea of biophilia, which is human beings are supposed to be in nature. Nature's good for us, and when we're surrounded by nature, we are healthier. So in an urbanizing world, where does new green space come from? Now, I'm going to jump very quickly to healthy streets and to healthy cities. We actually do know as urban designers how to create healthy places that lead to healthier citizens and populations. So when we say, oh, yeah, this is going to be this cost burden, it's not particularly difficult to design new cities that embed healthy behaviour. These are the following things we know: active transport, cycling, bountiful green and blue spaces, active centres, social spaces, mixed-use spaces, density, really critical, connectivity, clean air, and equitable spaces. One of the things that we also know is really important is green streets. So a recent study, I think it was 2016 in Toronto, found that people that live on tree-lined streets are less likely to report high blood pressure, obesity, heart disease, and diabetes. And they had the health benefit effects equivalent to being 7 years younger, or, if you're interested in the area, the economic effect of earning, I think it was $10,000 extra a year. My contention is that green streets are a form of health infrastructure and green infrastructure. They are a preventative solution to some of the crises that we are seeing. My other contention is this: the kinds of future streets that we should be seeing need to be shared and active, complete, designed for people, and spaces that enable everyday activity to spill out. The kinds of streets that we probably saw 100 years ago before the invention of the car. Now, there's some difficulties to bringing this around, though. So how do we do this? The first is this: we need to build better cities and we need to build better streets. And we're doing that to an extent. This is an example of some of the projects that we've been working on recently, and I'm not going to go into all of the projects that we do day to day in our firm because it's boring, but essentially these are some of the principles we use. Network approach to streets, we prioritize cycling and walking, we create social spaces, we embed large canopy trees, we push back on engineers occasionally. We sometimes take developable land on street corners to enable large tree species, and we sometimes have long and deliberative conversations with state departments around co-locating services. Super interesting. The next solution is this: we need to change the standards. And what's really interesting and what I really like is that almost every state is in the process of doing this. So we're doing this right now in Queensland. We are the designers and the architects working with the engineers in a really collaborative, discussion-heavy process to create a document called Complete Streets. And the third thing we really need to do is retrofit existing streets. So this is an example of a typical Brisbane street. Now, Brisbane, and keeping in mind, we're in spring, hit 35 degrees over the weekend. And that is exactly what a street looks like. 20 metres wide, no planting, no trees. We're beginning to come in and actually green those streets. So they're becoming shared spaces. We're reducing the speed where we can to 20 Ks. We're expanding the verges. We're creating community parklands and bringing in play and urban agriculture. And these are some of the examples of the streets that we are, at the moment, working with councils and state to do. And here's one of the reasons why we're slowing down our streets. Is because if we want people to cycle, we need to make it safe to cycle. If you reduce from 60 Ks, which has an 80% fatality risk if you're hit, to 30 Ks, you only have a 5% chance of dying, and that's massive. So there's a few challenges with this, which I won't go into in too much detail. Here's a few locations that we're doing this in Sydney and in Bankstown. But I want to jump to something possibly more interesting. Now, this is Future Street in Sydney. It was a project that was done by the Institute of Landscape Architects. We brought in, I don't know if you know this, but that's actually Circular Quay. We brought in 100 tonnes of soil, thousands of trees and plants, and created a green street, a complete street, and a smart street, essentially to show the public what the street could be. One of the biggest problems we have is community buy-in. So it's all very well for designers and planners and departments to talk about what we should be doing. If you don't have the community buy-in behind you, it's unlikely to get through. Oops. Skipping ahead. The problem with Future Street, which was awesome, is that it was very top-down. And this happened in 2017. And when Future Street happened, I was in a bit of flux, and I realized something, which is if you're not building social capital in the community where you're working, you're not placemaking, you're just reorganizing the furniture. And this is all very well, but too often the kinds of streets that we design as planners and designers just end up being pretty basic and pedestrian. I was chatting to a colleague of mine in Canberra today about some of the new developments, and I said, how do they work out? And he said, yeah, we have trees in every street, but they don't get watered and they disappear. And that's new development. So you look around Canberra, it's beautiful and green, but where is the new green infrastructure coming from? And I think the biggest problem is the sense of ownership. Now, this is public land, but for too long, we've kind of assumed that it's someone else's space. If someone doesn't think of the verge as being their own, well, they're not going to water the tree, they're not going to look after it, and you end up with this sort of issue of increasing urban heat island effect. So, without getting into too much detail, the idea of public land is in constant flux. It's this idea of who has the right to the city and who has ownership. And it always moves between developers to council to state to people. What we're in the middle is really, really interesting. So I think we're in the middle of a kind of a radical change. I think it's partly to do with the millennials growing up, but I also think it's partly to do with what we're seeing in governments where they're actually handing over. We're seeing legislation that is changing, that's enabling people to have more say in their streets and more shared stewardship. I'm going to skip ahead very quickly because I'm aware of time. But we were asked in 2018 to design a future street similar to the Circular Quay one in Brisbane. And this time, we had a chance to do something quite different. And that was to actually partner with community organisations and design the street with them. And we created our own brief. It had to be biophilic, it had to be ecological, it had to be full of art, it had to be walkable, it had to celebrate difference, and it had to have social enterprise. We ended up partnering with, I think, 30 organisations the first year and then 40 organisations the following year. We took over the street, Gregory Terrace, as part of the Echo, which is the Royal Show. It sees 400,000 people coming to Brisbane every year. And then we demonstrated how you could create a healthy city, an urban rainforest. Brisbane obviously is subtropical, so it's not difficult. Urban agriculture on the street, art, virtual reality, and of course circular economies and climate change. And these are a few images of what it looks like. So incredibly green, and what you're looking at is what is ordinarily pavement. This is the VR, the urban rainforest, the urban agriculture hub. And of course, we asked people what they wanted to see as well. It led to something that I'm very proud of, and that was a movement. Out of that, a lot of the organisations came together and they created something called Green the Street. And since then, we've had something like 30 street parties. Quite often, they involve cycling and verge planting and festivals, so art and music and everything else. And this is doing it again. A large community has formed. And it's ended up spilling out to areas of Brisbane that you wouldn't expect. So green-dominated areas, LNP-dominated areas, and Labor areas. It's also started a bit of a debate, as verges have been taken over across streets around the city. We've started a kind of advocacy against turf. Now, this might seem a bit odd. Turf is not a good thing. Turf is your enemy. Turf is a water, fertilizer, and pesticide-intensive monoculture. If you are at all interested in ecology, get rid of your grass. Even weeds are better from an ecology perspective. Some of the environmental advantages of what we're doing is that we are seeing reduced rates of turf. We're radically increasing the ecology. We're seeing reduced rates of watering. We know that it reduces summer temperatures because we're beginning to plant trees in these spaces as well. We're putting in urban forests and urban ag. There's massive amounts of habitat creation. Again, I mean, half of it's to do with just getting rid of turf. You could put European species in and you're doing a good job. So just feel good if you do that. Doesn't matter what kind of plants you put in there. And then, of course, there's this community benefits of green streets. So Andrew mentioned this idea of social spaces and like doing double good. One of the things that we do when we do these green planting events is we say, bring a plant, bring a beer, see you there. So it's not just about greening the street, it's also about bringing communities and neighbours together and actually knowing who is around you and kind of starting those conversations. And there are some real friendships that have come out of it, which is amazing. I think it's really important as well because it gives ownership of place and space back to people. It encourages self-determinancy, it creates capability and capacity. I'm a designer, I'm an urban designer and I design streets. I don't think I should be designing every street. I think people and the people that live on those streets should be part of the design process. And the only way you can do that is if you give it over. And to those that question it, gosh, and are worried about like the mess, most of the time it actually increases the value of their housing. And they are going to sell for an increased price, it's fine. It also makes the street spaces, and engenders equity and accessibility and so forth. The street is for everyone. We need to reclaim it. Finally, in Brisbane at least, it is putting pressure from people onto the politics, and we're seeing more and more green projects, which is awesome. I'm going to skip through these last ones. And of course, because of COVID, there's a real opportunity. What is happening and what has happened is these ideas have suddenly become palatable because everyone has been at home. They've begun to see the green space around them as so much more important. I've just included a few examples, one from New York, from London, from Melbourne, again from London, of projects where usually government departments actually, have reclaimed the street for pedestrians, cyclists, and for trees. And I think we're in a really interesting place right now where it's not a hard ask or a hard sell to get people and departments to do this. And these are some of the cities responding to COVID-19 that are doing similar things. So it's all about cycleways, greenery, and activation. And finally, to end, And I might have jokingly said it's not about climate change, it really is. This is the street that we green each year, Gregory Terrace. This is the vision that we showed people. By the way, this is an augmented reality version, so it's a bit distorted. But the reality is, if we don't do things like this, we're going to end up with another future vision. This is 2050. And that is something where the trees around us actually die. I'd much rather this. Let's green the street.
Catherine, thank you so much. We've heard from Andrew about the importance of creating social spaces, and from Catherine about the urban design dimension, how we can facilitate that process. Shelley, I want to turn back to you now to summarise some of the issues we've heard, perhaps give us your reflections, and then we'll go to the questions from the audience after that.
Thanks, Genevieve. How's the volume there? I don't want to be yelling at you.
No, I think you're good now.
Okay.
I think that's okay. Yep.
Thanks. Okay, I won't re-summarise too much, but I just wanted to draw out a couple of key points that I think were common themes from both Andrew and Catherine, and also aligned with a lot of the kinds of stuff that I was talking about as well. I think health and wellbeing are just emerging as obviously critical, and the relationship of place design to human health and wellbeing is profound, and there's now, as Catherine alluded to, lots of evidence that supports that biphilic design and so on, and I won't repeat all that stuff, I'm sure many of you are aware of it. But also the role of community, place equality, but also community in supporting our health and wellbeing. Sorry, I'm looking down reading my scribbled notes. It's really clear that we're at a fairly critical moment where we need to do things that actively support us as human life, but also that we're part of an interconnected and complex system, that we share the planet with multiple other living beings, and we need to work together, and that means actually consciously thinking about what are our own complex needs. They're more than just functional needs like being able to get from A to B. So again, as Catherine said, the complexity of places, what they need to do for us, what they do for us, whether we plan them or not, but what they can do by using our sophistication and intelligence to avoid monofunctional design and to serve human needs more fully. I think that very much aligns with Andrew's comments around community, and part of that also that came through both was the idea of the local and the importance of the local. And again, I think COVID-19 has really drawn our attention to that. We've been in lockdown in Melbourne here. We've, as you know, had prolonged lockdown, and we've been limited to a 5 kilometre radius of movement. And so that's forced local engagement in a way that's been hard for a lot of people, but it's also been incredibly positive in other ways. People have been actively engaging with supporting their local traders by getting takeaway food or whatever they can purchase, talking to the people in the street because they're out there walking and they're engaging. People have actually been doing a lot of greening in the way that Catherine's been talking about, just spontaneously having time and also the desire and seeing the potential of engaging. So I think there's fabulous lessons that we can learn, and that through both of those presentations, it seems to me that we've got this opportunity through the year that we've had and COVID-19 that we're still living with, to really see and celebrate some of the positive requirements that can help us to serve human needs more fully. The other thing I just wanted to mention, I think that came through with Catherine, but also with Andrew, who's a master of data, and his stats are always incredible. We still have a tendency, though, to reduce analysis to the numbers, and we kind of have to do that. It's something that we've always done. So this isn't a criticism of Andrew or Catherine, but it is a criticism of how we've tended to analyse and then make decisions on what we should do, how we measure proposals and solutions. So numbers can only measure certain things, typically time and money are the main ones. Health is very data rich, and so that's enabled some great analysis. And again, Catherine spoke to that really well, which is fantastic in helping us do more complex, meaningful things. But there's still a gap, and it's in our ability to analyse and celebrate and invest in things like delight and things that talk to the human spirit, how we connect as people in communities in the way that Andrew's talked about. So there's a challenge for us going forward. I'm just talking to myself on a screen here, which is quite weird, so I've got no idea what the response is out there. I'm going to be quiet now and hand it back to Catherine and hopefully some questions.
Okay, look, we do have some time for questions. Kate's got the microphone there, so please put your hand up if you'd like to ask something. But I actually just want to put a question first to both of you, to Catherine and to Shelley. One of the major concerns we have here in Canberra is that densification is a major risk to our green space, and that by pursuing it, the fear is that we are currently actively losing something. Now, I wonder whether we don't actually see enough really good urban design to show people that we can have both density and livable, green, welcoming urban spaces. But maybe, Catherine, to you first, how do you respond to that?
I mean, I think that's a genuine concern, and I can kind of see it when I see some of the developments, that they don't necessarily have that mix of biophilic design and good green space. And Canberra is beautiful, but it's a very like traditional sort of design. If you are going into the space and you're putting in turf and you're putting in standard street trees, then yeah, you're going to lose a lot of ecology. If you're going to go into a space though and design it around the original ecology, then you're giving back. I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but there's two departments that look after public space in Canberra?
We've got two authorities. We've got the City Renewal Authority and the Suburban Land Agency. Okay. There's a very long, very complicated political history.
I'm not going to say too much then.
Behind that, which we really will not go into
right,
at this juncture. And the National Capital Authority, that's right, three.
All right, well then I'll say something positive. You can really see evidence of habitat restoration though in the landscape around your light rail. So it is possible to do. We just need to get people behind it, and it's also shifting the prism away from what is considered tidy and aesthetically pleasing to something that is better for us. The science supports this idea that the more complexity you have in an environment, the more restorative it is. So, look, grass and a tree is pretty good for you, but if you had grass and a meadow and a tree and flowers and vines, that's even more. That's even better. So it's possible to do both. We just have to get better at it.
And I think one of the great values in Canberra is that we are all, I think, only 10 minutes drive from a patch of bushland. So we've got bushland all around us with those Burley Griffin plans never to impede the ridges and the ridge lines. And we're sitting a few minutes away from the O'Connor Ridge, for example, and the Aranda bushland. Yeah. Yes, please, Shelley. Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt. It happens to be one of my passions, that particular question, because I referred in my introductory comments to the importance of the particularities of place, and I think that is a key to designing well, whether you're designing, adding on to an existing house, or you're designing for a city and you're designing urban structure. Canberra has this pervasive landscape that you referred to, and that is a defining characteristic of it. It's extremely important. You can feel and see it at the Uber scale, but people experience it all the time, walking in streets and walking through. I completely agree with Kathy. That landscape can certainly be more complex and more rich and more diverse and biodiverse. But setting aside that detail, in one way, I think it gets down to design, clever design, how we can support greater density, and densification is a good thing because it limits negative impacts in terms of sprawl. It also gives people greater access to a whole range of services and things that they need more readily. It reduces commutes and so on. but designing cleverly to enable landscape to be pervasive and powerful throughout is absolutely possible and doable if we just acknowledge that that's a key priority. So it's how you densify, where you densify, where you permit height and not permit height. It's kind of like the default in Melbourne tends to be either 3-storey buildings or towers with development. If the land price hits a certain level, a tower becomes viable until that's what goes up. In Williamstown, we're really a 2 to 3 storey place. We've got wide streets that were laid out the same week by Robert Hoddle in the same week that the Melbourne Grid was laid out, but we're a low scale sort of village. And as a consequence though of that street grid, we've got really broad skies, broad streets. It feels like a seaside town in some ways, but we've got a few buildings that are popping up at 12 stories that are completely incongruous. We could have had the same densification and yield outcomes, and we've done studies to demonstrate this, in lower rise that would have been more respectful of the inherent qualities and particular areas of place, and therefore probably contributed better. So that's just another example. It's how you densify, how you do it, but you have to identify what it is that you prioritise about the qualities of that place.
I think we've got a question down here. Go ahead.
I've written this down just to be clear. Before self-government, Canberra suburbs had the infrastructure in place before the residents moved in. Since self-government, the suburbs of Gagalan, Tuggeranong and Molonglo never got the employment hubs, the transport services and the community facilities of much of the rest of Canberra. Has Canberra's urban planners that kind of helped design our great city been replaced by property developers who are focused on money and the ACT politicians focused on re-election?
I get a sense that you've got a view here.
No comment.
Shelley, I'm going to turn to you because you have some experience, but it's in the past now, which perhaps makes you able to comment on this. I mean, this does articulate the fears of many Canberrans that what was an outstanding piece of urban design with a lot of wonderful values, and Andrew referred earlier to, you know, the glory of the O'Connor shops, but that is being obliterated by the speed with which we're having urban development, and that development often, and it's absolutely right, but many of the residents say, we have nothing here. We're still waiting for there to be schools and ovals and parks and the things that we need to live there. But Shelley, how do you respond?
Well, I'm not involved at all in planning in the ACT now, and I am a bit out of date on that, although I am a member of the Suburban Land Agency, so that's interesting. But we're very much wanting to do, and what I'm seeing here in Melbourne too, is the need, and I completely agree, we need to be much more sophisticated in how we plan places and how we support local communities and environments. So I just think there's, historically, I'm going to talk more about Melbourne at the moment because that's where I live and work and see this unfolding at a much bigger scale. There's a disconnect still between, say, within government in Victoria, despite the best intentions and people wanting to do the right thing and great sophistication and capability of, say, the transport planners and the land use planners, and then our planning laws here, I don't believe are strong enough, and I think there is a tendency of governments to be cautious around development and sort of not lay down the law too strongly, whereas my personal view is we have the ability to envisage what we need. We know that people need all sorts of complex things and that we need to make places that support that, serve those needs. And I think government actually should be stronger about protecting the public good in that regard and be very clear about that in planning policy. And that's something I'm fairly vocal on down here. I'm not sure if that's really answering the question.
Well, I think if we go to sort of the greater generalities, and Catherine, I'll turn it to you. And one of the things you talked about, for example, was embedding large trees. And I made an instant note. I thought, how do you do that? How do you embed large trees? Because our outer suburban development here, yeah, it's got room for trees, but they're often quite small trees. And our streets are quite small, and people build very large houses on the blocks. And the room for, and I live along Wattle Street in Lynham, which has got a huge canopy of beautiful mature oak trees, and they are glorious, and it lifts the heart to drive along them. I can't think of a single street in Gungahlin or what's going in down in the Molonglo Valley that would fit that. So, I mean, is it about a change of standards? Is it about mandating embedding large trees as an example of the kinds of infrastructure that you need to make places livable?
I mean, I think so.
Yeah.
If you have to get down into the detail, it is taking a little bit of the developable land, but not very much. And there's a benefit there because, you know, the developer creates these beautiful streets that then, if they're competing against another developer, look better. But you have to do that at the early stage. The urban designer or the planner, the master planner, has to have that chat. Well, the way we do it is we take our pieces from our street corners. It's really easy. It doesn't cut the value of that corner block off that much. And then we're able to put like a big fig. Those grow huge in Queensland. They're gigantic. Or we add on, and I don't know how many people are planners here, but we add on a couple of extra meters, and then we deviate the verge so that you have these areas that are kind of like weaving in and out, and they allow for large trees. So it's like the most moderate reduction in developable land, and it just takes a little bit of creativity as well. So the other thing we do is orient the streets close to where creeks are and so forth, and we allow green views in. I mean, the design is in the detail. Like I could give you a million examples. There are the urban designers and the master planners out there that can do this, and my advice is if there's any developers in the audience, go to them.
And I think the other issue here is also that in the past people were more inclined to plant big trees themselves. Catherine, go ahead.
Thanks, Genevieve. I'm really very interested in this hierarchy and ratio of green space to tarmac, and it's something that I'm the ACT government architect, and it's something that I consider frequently, often, regularly, all those things, and I don't think it has to cut down on the development area. But what I observed some time ago was that, you know, our new suburbs have smaller blocks, and our housing footprint is very large in relation to the block. So the plot ratio is larger, and so the opportunity to grow a decent sized tree is so constrained, and we see in all the new suburbs how that struggle is carried out. And I don't think we need to split the atom, but what we do need is a change in standards, and we need to reorder our hierarchy. So the car which started off as a great idea and a good servant became a benign dictator. Possibly in the 60s, the car was a benign dictator, and then now it's a needy tyrant. And the car is dictating everything about how our cities are and how we live. And so Catherine talked about the design of our street corridors. And if we reorient our priorities in a street corridor, so at the moment our street corridors, the highest priority is for garbage trucks and cars. And you'd all know that it is, you can, you know, how you want to use your streets is, you know, we want to get places fast, but we'll all need to reconsider the speed at which we fang around the city, because if we travel more slowly, we can make our streets narrower. It's, you know, that's something that we don't, actively recognise, and our transport engineers are not really allowed to go there. And so if we do need to change standards. We need to look at the contracts our government has with our waste collectors, who are driving the equivalent of the Oriana around our residential streets. And our residential streets and our housing layouts are to do with a turning circle of a waste truck.
Yeah.
I mean, crikey, can't we do it better? So what we need to do is recalibrate, reorder our hierarchies and put the human-centric activities at the top and our green, the ability to grow a decent sized tree in the verge. So what's got to give? It's the width of the road that's got to give. It also means that there's got to be some smart design about how we coordinate and place our services. Services happen in those street corridors. I mean, here we are in 2020. It's not rocket science to be able to coordinate services. Well, I don't think it is, but apparently traffic engineers do think it's rocket science. Hence, they're not looking at it. So, I mean, the public land is going to have to do the heavy lifting on urban heat island effect and the opportunities to grow big trees. And so our street corridors are an enormous resource, and if we can recalibrate the hierarchy of priorities, that's where we should be going.
I'd love to put that to you, Catherine, as to how you persuade government to do that. I think everything Catherine said is spot on there, but how do you actually say to local government you're dealing with, one tier of government here in the ACT, this is what we think needs to happen for very good social reasons?
Okay. It was Catherine, right?
Yes.
You hit on something that's like the bugbear of all urban designers, and no one talks about it at these talks. I've done it before, I sounded demented, and that's bin trucks. But they actually are the enemy, like alongside turf, because those turning circles prohibit so much of what we can do when we retrofit existing streets. And I'm not lying when I say this. If we change the type of bin trucks we had to smaller versions and European versions, we would be able to retrofit so many more of old streets in cities and make them green. And I say that because I've done that with Bradshaw Street. We could have got a 7-metre park through the centre of that 20-metre wide street were it not for the bin trucks and were it not for the turning circles. And we've had this debate, and we've actually managed it with developers before, where they have said, we really want a good design outcome. The bin trucks are the problem, and they've negotiated with council and actually gone and bought them new, this sounds bonkers, but new bin trucks. It's that fine grain, there's a pain to deal with. And I think sometimes, I think we need to change the standards, we need to place people at the top and prioritise greenery. My position is that empowering people has probably the biggest positive effect, because it puts pressure onto politicians, and then that puts pressure onto the local council, because Brisbane City Council, I mean, this is just my domain, but it's a very powerful council, and you need people pushing them to do things. State government in Queensland is actually pretty advanced, and we are working with them really well. But it really does sometimes come down to these ridiculous details, and that's where we have to change the standards, and we have to be honest about the silly things like bin trucks. It's going to affect how green your streets are.
I think this is a cause for a campaign, surely. Replace the bin trucks. One more question. Sorry, go ahead, Shelley.
Can I just contribute to that?
Yes, please.
Just contribute to that one. I actually want to offer a slight counterpoint. It's not a disagreement with Catherine's response, but it's just to say that a lot of it's about policy and the machinery of government. So, for example, in Victoria, we have multiple transport departments and authorities, and each of them has a remit, and their job is to deliver on that remit. And they can try to go beyond it, but they have to deliver on that. In New York, the Department of Transport is one Department of Transport, and they're responsible for all transport. Cars, buses, bikes, pedestrians, that's all transport. So if the policy says pedestrians are the top priority, then you don't have an argument about a speed limit, a slip lane, the street width, and whether there should be a tree or not, because the pedestrian experience and safety is number one, and that will be prioritised. There's not this debate and tussle. So I agree, and we've got very small garbage trucks that City of Melbourne uses, which is a deliberate policy outcome. They're symptomatic, but I think it actually starts with policy. So yes, the citizens have to be vocal and have to be engaged and get that voice to government, but government needs to then prioritise and establish really significant policy that's holistic. It's like the trees in the suburbs problem. Not everybody wants to plant a tree in their backyard, and I think we should have more trees, but you can't force people to grow trees. But we also do things like waffle slabs now, which can't have a tree within 5 metres, and most backyards don't have 5 metres to play with. So even if you wanted a tree, you probably can't put a substantial tree in because we've got this system of using waffle slabs. So it's actually a cultural thing. And again, I think part of that goes back to policy setting and rhetoric Andrew referred to earlier, how we talk about things, what we say prioritising of what we get from those more complex solutions.
I think we'll have just one more question at the back of the room, and then I'll turn back to Shelley for her summing up of the big ideas that have come out of this, but go ahead, yeah.
Thank you. I was just going to say that one of the biggest issues I think we have...
Hang on, we just can't hear you, sorry.
Oh, sorry, can you hear me now?
I think so.
Or now?
Yeah, go ahead.
One of the biggest issues I think isn't necessarily with policy or government, but it's actually with people. And living in Molonglo myself, so a new area, a completely greenfield, I managed to have 40 trees on my block, even though I've got a waffle, so it is possible, and it's a standard suburban block. But my neighbours who come to our house when we have open houses and kind of gush over how lush our garden is, continue to not just plant turf, but artificial turf, which I think is the biggest killer in new suburbs. And they continue to rip out their nature strips, put black plastic down around the tiny, sad little street tree that we've got, and then lay artificial turf, which of course,
Looks
strangles.
neat though, Shannon. Looks nice and tidy, doesn't it? Yeah.
It really does. And it's very low maintenance because everything dies.
Yeah.
So how do we actually encourage the residents to actually want a tree in their backyard, to build a house that's slightly smaller so they can fit one tree in their yard, or heaven forbid actually do something on their verge that might support their street tree instead of killing it?
Yeah, I think this is actually a really mysterious puzzle because some people just do not seem to be animated at all to want to interact with nature, which I find bizarre and puzzling. You must, Catherine, come up against that from time to time. People who just really don't want trees and grass and flowers.
Yeah, definitely.
I do not know or understand these people, but...
Yeah, I mean, I said it earlier in the talk, but it's changing the aesthetics around like what is beautiful. One of the problems, and we see this in the academic literature, is that the more urbanized a nation becomes, the more people don't see natural wild landscapes as beautiful anymore. They start to see sort of clipped landscapes as beautiful, and I mean that you have to basically push back against that and celebrate nature in as many ways as you possibly can, and I think showing people that there is beauty in it, and that's what we're trying to do when we do these showcases at the Echo. Like the Echo is when the country comes to the city, so it's not like a design event. It's everybody in Brisbane from all sorts of places coming, and we're trying to say like this is a form of beauty, and try and get a culture change in that way. But it's it's a really good question. I don't entirely know how you do it. People are always going to have their own ideas about what's aesthetically beautiful. At any verge planting we have, there's always a debate. There's always like the super eco warriors that say everything has to be native, everything has to be worsted. Then there'll be somebody who's brought along some European plants, and someone that's brought some like a banana tree one time. And you just have to mediate it. Like you just have to say, and I always do this, I'm just like, everything is better than turf. So like, let's just start from there and go on. But yeah, I mean, it's a debate. I don't know how you solve it, to be honest.
Shelley, do you have any thoughts on that before we go to your summing up? I mean, it strikes me that this is the purpose of having things like urban food forests and the like, is that you kind of impose them on neighbourhoods without people having to put them in their own backyards necessarily.
Yeah, look, I think I've got some comments, but I might even use it as a way of getting to kind of some sort of summing up, if that works.
Go ahead. Segue seamlessly.
Oh, sorry?
I said segue seamlessly into your summing up. Feel free.
Okay. hopefully seamlessly. I guess I can't help thinking, going back to some of Andrew's comments around community and the importance of that, but what he spoke about very much was the idea of culture. I don't know whether he used the word culture, but he talked about the going from we to me, and hopefully scope to go back to we. And I think that stuff is really critical and fundamental to the kinds of social upheaval that we're seeing at the moment. And America is kind of like a beacon for it, but of course all around the world there are issues. I think the reality is that we are different, we're diverse, and we have, some people don't want a garden and will never want a garden. And I want a garden, I like garden, you know, I think we should have more street trees. I agree with all of that, but I can't make somebody else think and feel the same way as me. But we can influence one another, and I think we can do it in a way that's respectful and compassionate. And that to me is at the core of community and the idea of we that Andrew was talking about. So community and culture, and culture evolves, and we can actively help to shift it. So I'm just wondering whether, I think I'm supposed to give some provocations, and I might sort of try to go to that. To me, it seems to be about dealing with one another with compassion, not being dismissive of things that we don't agree with, certainly trying to help influence change, and where we see something wrong, doing something about it. And not at all resiling or kind of closing our eyes to things that we know could be better, but kind of perhaps more living what we believe to be right, putting our money where our mouth is, getting out and planting our own verge, hopefully persuading by the evidence of numbers and data that show, like the health research that Catherine was referring to, how much we can benefit in terms of health, and there are flow-on economic benefits from that by greening spaces, but also through evidence of experience. You know, and what I mean by that is the experience of green streets and so on that people can enjoy, but also the experience of being treated with respect and compassion that I think does help people to relax and become more open perhaps to listening, and maybe they'll contemplate putting a tree in their backyard after all when they see that other people have done it and it's actually really nice, and now birds come and all that kind of stuff. So I think demonstrating acting as, you know, as we would like to, treating others as we'd like to be treated with respect and compassion, but also living the best lives that we can and contributing as much as we can. And part of that's about living in community and contributing to community. So saying hello to our neighbours, doing things as part of the hyper-local shift, if we supporting employees, if we have them to work from home if they want to, or closer to home if that works for them, investing in local businesses and building more complex local economies that enable people to stay at home and not have to commute, reducing pressure on public transport, as well as designing well and designing with compassion. I've kind of rambled there, but I hope I've captured some of the key themes and maybe suggested some things that I think we perhaps could and should try to do. I think we have to be active, but I think we also need to be celebrate diversity and positively influence through how we act, but also through really driving government to set good policy and establish good machinery that means policy can actually be effectively delivered.
I think the call to design with compassion is a pretty attractive one, isn't it? That's actually a wonderful, wonderful idea. We are pretty much at the end of our time together, and there are some thank yous that are due. I want to thank very much Andrew Lee, who's departed. Andrew's son does hip hop every Monday afternoon, and he said to us, far cooler at 14 than his father will ever be. So it was wonderful to have Andrew here. Also, Catherine Simpson, who's spoken to us so interestingly about the Green Street, and Shelley Penn, our provocateur. Please thank all three of them. And I just want to also thank the sponsors for these events, the Suburban Land Agency, indeed, the Midnight Hotel, and our platinum sponsors, beverage sponsors, Prosecco, Lake George Wine and Capital Brewing. I believe there is time to have a drink. We're allowed to have a drink and have a bit of a yarn about all these things. Thank you all so much. Thank you.
Right.